Hi and welcome. This week I'm going to talk about the Gilera Nuovo Saturno. This is a 1988 350 model. Now, this particular bike came about in a very interesting manner. In 1985, Gilera released a Dakota range of dirt bikes, and that engine caught the attention of the Japanese importer of Gilera, Saturno, and they thought it would make a particularly fine single-cylinder sports bike. So in conjunction with the Gilera factory, they designed this particular bike, the Nuovo Saturno. Now the Saturno name is also quite a famous name. It stems from a range of sports bikes that Gilera produced from the end of the Second World War through to 1959 in 500cc capacities. Now, the Nuovo Saturno pays homage to that heritage, but also brings the whole sports bike right up to date to late 1980s standards. So the standout feature of this bike is its water-cooled twin overhead cam engine. Now, the engine has a capacity of 348 cc's. It has twin overhead cams, as I said, and a 4-valve head. It's water-cooled, has a bore and stroke of 80 millimeters by 69 millimeters, and runs a compression ratio of 9.5 to 1, and puts out around 33 horsepower at 7,500 RPM. Now the 500 version produces about 10 horsepower more than that. And that power is put to the ground through a 5-speed gearbox and a final drive through a chain. Suspension-wise, the bike in stock form runs Masoki suspension at both ends. There's no adjustment on the 40mm forks on the front, and there's just preload only on the end. This particular bike, though, is running a much more exotic Ceriani front end, which is fully adjustable, and is running a Öhlins remote reservoir shock on the back, which again is fully adjustable. So this particular bike has had suspension upgrades. And I will say that whilst this is a fairly light motorcycle, the suspension performs remarkably well. And from what I've read, the stock suspension was also very good. There's certainly an advantage in lightweight. The weight figures for this bike are around 147 kilos. Now, I'm not sure whether that's dry or wet, but it's certainly, this motorcycle has a fairly low center of gravity and is very light on the road. Handling wise, this is a particularly nimble motorcycle, and again that comes down to the lack of weight. Low weight really gives you a very quick changing motorcycle, and this really shows it in the corners. It changes direction easily and fast, and is certainly very stable at high speed. This particular bike is fitted with a steering damper, which may assist high-speed stability in a small measure, but I have the feeling that this bike would probably be stable at speed even without that. Now, braking-wise, we've got a 300mm cast iron disc on the front with a 4-piston Goldline Brembo caliper on that, and the front brake is very powerful. Combined with the fairly light weight, this motorcycle pulls up almost as fast as a modern motorcycle. Now the rear brake is a 240mm cast iron disc with a 2-piston Gilera caliper fitted. And the rear brake was certainly progressive and really nice to use. Now the wheels fitted to this bike are Mavic 3-spoke cast alloy wheels, and they're fitted on the front with a 110/70/17 tyre, and on the rear a 140/70/17. Now the first thing you notice when you ride this motorcycle is the performance of this 350 water-cooled single. It's really quite impressive for a 350 single of the era. Around town it's happy to sit between 4,000 and 5,500 RPM, has plenty of torque and is ideal for tootling around. But once you let those revs build over 5,500 RPM, the motorcycle accelerates quite briskly to 8,000 RPM. And if you do your change-ups just at the red line there, you will soon find yourself doing very illegal speeds. I reckon that this 350 probably has a top speed somewhere between 150 to 157 kilometers per hour. It's rather hard to judge, but I'm just basing that on there was plenty of reserve in the motor in the speeds I was doing on the road. Now you do find that you have to be fairly precise with your gear changes once you actually get it into the power band and you're riding it in a sporting manner. If the engine goes off the boil, you will find yourself bogged down. Part of this could be due to the gear ratios. They didn't really change the gear ratios when they transplanted the engine from the original dirt bike into the road bike, but I don't think that's a real problem. If you're sports riding, you just need to keep the engine on the boil. And you know, that's part of the skill of riding a small capacity single anyway. You really do need to learn the characteristics of your engine and where the power is and how to utilize it to its fullest. Now, the controls on the motorcycle are fairly standard 1980s, early 90s fare. We've got your basic Italian switch blocks on both sides. There's nothing out of the ordinary there. Now, the dash has a speedo, a tacho and a temperature gauge, and a number of lights for indicators, neutral and other functions there. So there's nothing really out of the ordinary there. Now, styling wise, as I said earlier, this is the Isle of Man edition. There's a few differences to the standard Saturno from what I can tell, and there's so many slight variations and there's such little documentation of the history of these bikes, it's rather difficult to tell what is stock and what is not. But I do know that the Isle of Man edition does run a different seat, which is more racer-like, and this is certainly the case. It's slightly smaller than the seat on the standard model. The tank is the same, and it also runs a slightly different fairing. Now, I'm unsure about the indicators. I do know that the rear ones have probably been changed on this bike, but I have seen photos of other Saturnos with these rather odd little indicators on the front there. So I'm not sure whether that's just a Japanese point of difference or whether a number of bikes were released with those indicators on. Certainly the Saturnos released into the British market had more traditional indicators mounted on stalks, and they had a slightly different fairing fitted to them. So who was this motorcycle aimed for back in the day? Well, I think it was purely targeting someone who's looking for a no-compromise sports motorcycle. And from that point of view, I think it truly delivers. From a styling point of view, it's really attractive. The half fairing gives it a sense of speed even when it's standing still. The long tank and single racing seat really sort of epitomizes the style of race bikes of the era, and just the overall look, you know, with the large disc brake on the front, the alloy wheels, the twin exhaust on this Isle of Man edition. You know, it's overall a very beautiful package. But it's not a particularly practical motorcycle for day-to-day use. Yes, it is uncomfortable. You know, I rode it about 40 kilometers and I found by the end of it, I was feeling fairly uncomfortable. The only issue I had was that the seat's quite low, the pegs are quite high, which means that for someone of my height, I am actually folded up fairly tight. But after the first couple of kilometres, I sort of grew acclimatised to that. The only advantage of the low seat is that the handlebars are not too low. You certainly are tucked in behind that screen, and from that point of view, you know, while it's not a practical bike for doing long distances on, for a bit of travel to the local cafe, or to head off to the hills and find some corners and really carve them up, I think you could really enjoy this motorcycle, particularly if you have an interest in Italian bikes of that era. You know, they have a lot more go than Italian bikes of earlier eras. You know, this engine, as I said earlier, it really loves to rev, and you know, it's overall, it's a really nice package. The only downside of the Saturno is that there is really a lack of spare parts available. You know, a lot of the unique components for this motorcycle would be difficult to source if you needed to replace them. Engine components probably aren't too bad because the engine was, as I said, used in the Dakota range of dirt bikes, but some of the cosmetic parts would be a lot more difficult to source. And from that point of view, you know, you really have to make the decision whether you want to own something that requires a bit of search and a bit of hard work in locating parts if and when you need them. And that can put some people off who just want to ride a motorcycle. But in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I've really enjoyed this riding experience. I enjoyed it so much I bought the bike. So hopefully we'll do a few more stories on this bike down the track. But that's about all I've got to say about it at the moment, and I'll see you next time.